Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The gun felt colder than the rain slicking his hair, and the man holding it looked like death incarnate. One misdialed number. That was all it took to turn Julian's mundane Tuesday evening into a spiral of blood, chrome, and terror. He hadn't meant to intrude on the private line of the city's most notorious shadow. He had just wanted to order takeout after a double shift at the hospital. But the voice that had answered wasn't taking an order. It was issuing a command for an execution. Now, standing in the alleyway with the barrel of a suppressor pressed against his temple, Julian realized that the static-filled apology he'd stammered into the receiver hadn't been enough. The man before him, eyes like shattered obsidian and a suit that cost more than Julian's medical school debt, tilted his head. "You have a choice, little doctor," the man whispered, his voice a velvet caress over a razor blade. "You can die here as a witness, or you can live as my property." Julian swallowed the metallic taste of fear pooling in his mouth. The rain battered the neon-lit pavement of Sector 4, washing away the grime of the city, but doing nothing to cleanse the sin radiating from the man in front of him. This was Cashin Draxos, the Viper, the man the police didn't dare investigate and the politicians paid to look the other way. And Julian, a 26-year-old resident specializing in trauma surgery, had just interrupted his business. I didn't hear anything," Julian stammered, his hands raised, trembling despite his best efforts to steel himself. He was used to blood. He was used to the frantic energy of the ER. He was not used to the predator standing inches from him, smelling of expensive sandalwood and fresh gunpowder. Cashin stepped closer, invading Julian's personal space with the arrogance of a man who owned the very air they breathed. He lowered the gun slowly, the threat not diminishing but shifting into something more insidious. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand gripping Julian's chin, forcing him to look up. "You heard enough to stop breathing," Cashin corrected, his thumb brushing over Julian's lower lip. "You heard a location. You heard a name. And then, surprisingly, you didn't hang up. You stayed on the line for 11 seconds. What?" It was a logical question, yet the answer felt absurd. "I was paralyzed," Julian admitted, his voice barely audible over the thrum of the rain. "I thought if I hung up, you'd trace it faster." A flicker of amusement danced in Cashin's dark eyes. "Paranoia. I like that. It keeps people alive." He released Julian's chin with a rough shove. "Get in the car." "What?" "The car." Cashin pointed to the sleek, armored sedan idling silently at the mouth of the alley. "My men botched the job you overheard because I was distracted by your heavy breathing on the line. Now I have a wounded lieutenant and no surgeon I can trust." "You're a doctor, aren't you? That badge on your scrubs isn't a prop." Julian looked at the car, then back at the gun Cashin had slipped back into his shoulder holster. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. "If I save him," Julian negotiated, a spark of defiance igniting in his chest, a trait that had always gotten him into trouble, "I walk away. I forget this happened. You forget I exist." Cashin opened the rear door, the interior light casting sharp shadows across his angular, devastatingly handsome face. He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Julian had ever seen. "Save him first, Julian. Then we'll discuss the price of your freedom." The penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, suspended high above the city's smog. It screamed lonely opulence. The white marble floors were currently being stained crimson by the man bleeding out on the Italian leather sofa. "Lungs," Julian announced, snapping into professional mode the moment he saw the patient. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but his hands knew what to do. He ripped open the man's shirt. "Gunshot wound to the chest. Sucking chest wound. I need alcohol, clean towels, boiling water, and a sewing kit. Now." Cashin leaned against the doorframe, watching. He didn't move to help, but he snapped his fingers, and two hulking subordinates scrambled to obey the doctor's orders. For the next hour, Julian was not a hostage. He was a god of life and death. He dug the bullet out with improvised tools, cauterized the vessel, and stitched the flesh with steady, rhythmic hands. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his scrubs stained with the blood of a criminal, but he didn't falter. When the patient's breathing stabilized, Julian slumped back onto the floor, wiping his hands on a towel. The adrenaline crashed, leaving him shaking. Slow clapping broke the silence. Cashin pushed off the wall and walked toward him. He didn't look at his lieutenant. His eyes were fixed solely on Julian. He stopped, towering over the exhausted doctor. Impressive, Cashin murmured. Most civilians would have fainted at the amount of blood involved. You didn't even flinch. I see worse on Saturday nights in the ER, Julian retorted, pushing himself to his feet. His legs felt like jelly. He'll live. Now our deal. Cashin hummed, a low, vibrato sound in his chest. He walked to a crystal decanter, poured a glass of amber liquid, and held it out. Julian hesitated, then took it, downing it in one burn. The deal, Cashin repeated, turning to look out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city lights. I said we would discuss it. I didn't agree to it. Julian stiffened. You gave me your word. I am a criminal, Julian. My word is flexible depending on the asset. Cashin turned back, his gaze raking over Julian's form. You have talent, discretion, and you have no family in the city, according to the background check my team ran while you were operating. You check me out. I know everything. Julian Vance, 26, top of your class, drowning in loans, single, lives in a studio apartment in the East District. You're isolated. Cashin took a step closer. And now, you are mine. I am not a thing you can own. Julian shouted, the glass nearly slipping from his fingers. I saved your man. Let me go. Cashin moved with supernatural speed. One moment he was by the window. The next he had Julian pinned against the marble pillar, his forearm bracing against Julian's throat, not choking, but trapping. You are involved now, Cashin hissed, his face inches from Julian's. The heat radiating off him was intoxicating, confusing Julian's fight-or-flight response. The rival family, the Koryo clan, knows someone was on the line. They traced the signal tower. They know a civilian was involved. If I let you go, you are dead within the hour. They will torture you for information you don't even have. Julian's breath hitched. He searched Cashin's eyes for a lie, but found only a cold, hard truth. So what? Julian whispered, his voice trembling. I stay here? As your prisoner? As my personal physician, Cashin corrected, his voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate. And perhaps other things. I have insomnia, Julian. Chronic. But tonight, when I heard your voice on the line, scared, defiant, alive, it was the first time in years I felt centered. It was a ridiculous, romantic notion for a man who killed for a living. Yet the intensity in Cashin's gaze made Julian's heart hammer against his ribs. I hate you, Julian breathed. Give it time, Cashin replied, pulling back, but leaving the ghost of his touch on Julian's skin. The guest room is down the hall. Don't try to leave. The guards have orders to shoot out kneecaps, not kill. And I'd hate to have to perform surgery on you. I'm not as gentle as you are. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of a gilded cage. Julian expected torture or abuse. What he got was a library, gourmet meals, and the confusing, terrifying presence of Cashin Draxos. It was a slow, agonizing burn. Julian hated him. He hated the arrogance, the violence that permeated the penthouse, the way Cashin would come home with bruised knuckles and a flat, dead look in his eyes. But he also saw the nightmares. One night, wandering the halls for water, Julian heard screaming. He followed the sound to the master bedroom. Cashin was thrashing in his sheets, shouting names of the dead. Julian should have walked away. He should have let the monster suffer. Instead, the healer in him took over. He sat on the edge of the bed and shook Cashin's shoulder. Cashin, wake up. Cashin woke with a violence that sent Julian tumbling to the floor. A gun was in Cashin's hand before his eyes were even open. When he focused and saw Julian rubbing his bruised elbow on the rug, the weapon lowered. For a moment, the mask slipped. Julian saw the exhausted, haunted boy beneath the warlord. Get out, Cashin rasped, sweat slicking his chest, his tattoos stark against the pale skin. No, Julian said, surprising himself. He got up and poured a glass of water from the nightstand. Drink. Cashin stared at him, bewildered. I could kill you. You could. But you won't. Julian handed him the glass. You said my voice centers you. So I'm talking. That night changed the dynamic. The power shifted, subtly. Cashin was still the captor, but Julian held the keys to his sanity. They began to talk. First about safe subjects, medicine, books, the weather. Then about philosophy, morality, the weight of a life. Julian found himself drawn to the complexity of the man. Cashin wasn't evil for the sake of evil. He was the product of a brutal world, holding back chaos with an iron fist. And Cashin looked at Julian as if he were the only source of light in a pitch-black universe. The tension grew thick enough to choke on. A brush of hands during dinner. A lingering glance across the library. The way Cashin would stand just a little too close, inhaling Julian's scent. It came to a head on a stormy Friday. Julian was reading in the study when Cashin stormed in, bleeding. A graze on his cheek, a deep gash on his arm. "Sit," Julian commanded, dropping his book. Cashin obeyed, collapsing into the armchair. He hissed as Julian applied antiseptic. "Why do you stay?" Cashin asked suddenly, his eyes boring into Julian's. "I left the front door unlocked yesterday. I know you checked it. You didn't leave." Julian paused, his hand hovering over the wound. Why hadn't he? Fear of the Koryo clan? Or was it because the thought of leaving Cashin to bleed alone made his chest ache? "I'm a doctor," Julian deflected. "I don't leave patients." "Liar," Cashin growled. He reached out, his hand gripping the back of Julian's neck, pulling him down. Their lips met in a crash of desperate energy. It wasn't a sweet kiss, it was a collision. It tasted of blood, whiskey, and suppressed longing. Julian made a noise of protest that quickly turned into a moan as Cashin's other hand tangled in his hair, anchoring him. For a moment, the world outside, the guns, the gangs, the rain, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of Cashin's body and the terrifying realization that Julian had fallen in love with the devil. Cashin pulled back, breathless, his forehead resting against Julian's. "You are my ruin, Julian. I knew it from the first call. And you are my disaster," Julian whispered back, unable to look away. The peace shattered 2 days later. The Koryo clan didn't just want Cashin dead. They wanted to dismantle him piece by piece. They found the weakness Cashin had tried so hard to hide. Julian was at the market, escorted by 2 guards, a rare privilege Cashin had granted, when the explosion happened. The blast threw him into a storefront window. Glass shattered. The world turned into a high-pitched ring. When Julian came to, he wasn't in the market. He was zip-tied to a chair in a damp, concrete warehouse. Standing in front of him was a man with a scar running through his lip, leader Han of the Koryo clan. "So," Han sneered, pacing around Julian. "This is the Alpha's pet. The doctor." Julian spat blood onto the floor. "I'm just a hostage." "Oh no. We know better." Han leaned in, holding up a phone. "We've been watching. Draxos doesn't look at hostages the way he looks at you. He doesn't leave meetings early to have dinner with hostages." Han dialed a number. He put it on speaker. "Speak," Han commanded. "Cashin," Julian croaked. "Julian." Cashin's voice was instantaneous, stripped of all composure. "Where are you?" "Sector 9. The old docks," Han interrupted. "Come alone, Draxos, or I send the doctor back to you in pieces." "If you touch him," Cashin's voice was a low, demonic growl that vibrated through the phone speakers. "I will burn your entire lineage to ash. You have 20 minutes. Han hung up. Julian's heart sank. "He won't come," he told Han. "He's a strategist. He won't walk into a trap for one person. We'll see." 18 minutes later, the warehouse doors blew inward. It wasn't a stealth entry. It was a declaration of war. Smoke grenades filled the room. Gunfire erupted from the catwalks. Through the haze, a figure emerged. Cashin. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, a dual wield of pistols in his hands. He moved with the fluidity of water and the brutality of a landslide. He wasn't alone, but he was the vanguard. He shot 3 men before they could even raise their weapons. Han grabbed Julian, hauling him up and pressing a knife to his throat. "Stop," Han screamed, "or the boy dies." The shooting stopped. The silence was deafening. Cashin stood 10 meters away. He was covered in soot and blood, his chest heaving. His eyes locked onto Julian's. There was no calculation in them anymore. Only terrifying, raw desperation. "Let him go," Cashin said, his gun lowered but not holstered. "Drop the weapon," Han demanded, pressing the blade deeper. A thin line of red trickled down Julian's neck. Cashin didn't hesitate. He dropped the guns. They clattered loudly on the concrete. Cashin, no. Julian screamed. Kill him. I can't risk you, Cashin said softly. Han laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. The great viper. Defanged by love. He raised his gun, aiming at Cashin's chest. But Han had made a mistake. He had assumed Julian was just a damsel. He had forgotten Julian was a trauma surgeon. He knew anatomy. He knew exactly where the clusters of nerves were in the human neck. As Han prepared to fire, Julian threw his head back, smashing it into Han's nose, shattering cartilage. As Han recoiled in shock, Julian didn't pull away. He stomped down on Han's instep and drove his elbow backward into the solar plexus. It wasn't a martial arts move. It was desperate, messy survival. But it created a 1-second gap. That was all Cashin needed. He didn't dive for his guns. He crossed the distance in a blur, tackling Han. The sound of breaking bone echoed in the warehouse. It was over in seconds. Cashin stood over Han's unconscious body, breathing hard. Then he turned to Julian. He didn't speak. He grabbed Julian, pulling him into a crush of an embrace that knocked the wind out of him. Cashin buried his face in Julian's neck, shaking. You idiot, Julian sobbed, gripping Cashin's shirt. You dropped your gun. You could have died. I would burn this city to the ground before I let them take you. Cashin murmured against his skin. I told you. You're mine. Julian pulled back, looking at the man who had just walked into hell for him. The alpha leader. The killer. The man who needed Julian's voice to sleep. And you, Julian whispered, wiping a smudge of blood from Cashin's cheek, are mine. The rain had returned by the time they walked out of the warehouse. Cashin's coat draped over Julian's shoulders. The sirens were distant wails in the night, irrelevant to the two men walking toward the black sedan. Julian looked at the city skyline, then at the hand firmly holding his own. He had made the wrong call that night in the rain. But looking at Cashin, watching the way the ruthless alpha softened only for him, Julian realized something. It might have been the wrong call, but it was the only right answer he had ever found. And that is how the viper tamed the wolf. Or perhaps, how the wolf learned to love the bite. If you enjoyed seeing Julian take control of his fate, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a man like Cashin, or is love not worth the danger? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then, prompt image. Prompt, masterpiece, best quality, high-res, 1.2. Korean manhwa style, semi-realistic, digital art, 2 men, BL, Yaoi, man 1. Cashin, tall, sharp jawline, black hair undercut, wearing unbuttoned blood-stained white dress shirt and shoulder holster. Intense possessive expression, holding man 2's face. Man 2. Julian, slightly shorter, soft brown hair, wearing blue medical scrubs and an oversized black suit jacket over shoulders, looking up with mix of fear and longing, bandaged neck. Background is a shattered warehouse interior with rain pouring in through broken skylights. Dramatic blue and orange cinematic lighting, moody atmosphere, floating dust particles, high contrast, detailed focus on eyes.